Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Welcome back to my weekday videos where I do interesting interviews and conversations with prominent people about storytelling and culture. But before we get into the interview, I just want to remind everyone that my Indiegogo campaign for my new graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes, is still open. You're looking at some of the spectacular art in the background. It is an 82-page spectacular of good old superhero epic storytelling and fun. The campaign has been shadow banned, so the only way that you can get to it is by having the direct link, and the link for that is in the description if you want to go over and take a look at my graphic novel. Also in the description is the link for my new graphic novel, the campaign for which will be starting in about 5 months. The link is for the early bird sign up page. If you sign up there for my new book, which is Crom the Destroyer, which is a fantasy book in the vein of Conan and the Celtic myth that inspired it. But if you go over to that early bird page and leave your email, you will receive an email when the project goes live. And if you then order anything from that campaign, you will receive a free pinup poster with your order. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, you might want to check out those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. So on with the interview. All right, so today I have with me Mike Barron. He is a preeminent storyteller in my estimation. He has written Punisher, Flash, Deadman, Star Wars, and a plethora of other Marvel and DC characters, as well as Badger and Nexus, which are his own creations, and won an Eisner Award for Nexus. So, Mike, thank you for coming and welcome to the Fourth Age.
My pleasure.
So I usually start off by asking a very general question, which is just to get an idea about your best kind of storytelling in your mind, because I usually want to just talk about storytelling and culture. So what, besides the stories that you've written, would you say is your favorite story? And you can pick any medium that you want.
You mean other writers?
Yes.
Oh, geez. I hardly know where to start because if you're a writer, you're also a reader. Uh, and I read voraciously, as every writer must. And I could never point to one book or one song or one comic that's my favorite. But the reason I'm writing today is because of John D. MacDonald, who was a great pulp writer who worked in the 60s and 70s. And he created a cult figure called Travis McGee. It was a pulp series that he wrote. And each book had a color in the title. And the first one was called The Deep Blue Goodbye. And I remember holding that in my hands on a sidewalk in Mitchell, South Dakota, where I grew up. I got it at a cigar store for 35 cents. And I thought, well, this guy's not doing this for his health. This is what I want to do for a living. And I started reading it, and I was absolutely hooked. And I'm not the only one. There are a whole bunch of pulp writers today who write because of John D. MacDonald. Uh, his Travis McGee was, he described as a loose jointed, gangling boat bum or salvage expert. And if you were robbed or wronged, he would get back half of whatever was taken. He would get back whatever was taken from you in exchange for half. Now, a lot of people aren't familiar with John D. MacDonald, but they certainly know the movie Cape Fear, which he wrote the novel. And it's been made into movies twice. The second one starring Robert De Niro in perhaps his most evil role. And as a kid, I also devoured science fiction, anything I could get my hands on. A.E. Van Vogt, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Philip Jose Farmer, Theodore Sturgeon, Roger Zelazny. I love them all. These days, I mostly read crime fiction or historical fiction or just straight history. But my favorite writers include Stephen Hunter, who writes about snipers. Uh, Robert Cray, who's an excellent crime writer, Randy Wayne White, who lives in Florida and is definitely a disciple of John D. MacDonald. He talks about when he and a friend of his were teenagers, they beached their boat on McDonald's private beach and went up to the door and said, "Could we meet Mr. McDonald? We like his books." And he had him in, and they had a nice discussion. And his character Doc Ford is very much in the Travis McGee mode. Um, as far as comics go, I was attracted to the art, and I collected every Barry Smith Conan, uh, and Bernie Wrightson Swamp Thing, and Paul Galassi Master of Kung Fu, and I love those books. I have to confess I don't read many comics these days, uh, mostly ones that I support via crowdfunding or books that people send me because they want me to comment, and I'm always happy to do that. Uh, but most comics these days are pretty bad. Theodore Sturgeon was another great science fiction writer, and he created Sturgeon's Law. 90% of everything is crap. And he was right. 90% of the movies are crap. 90% of the TV shows are crap. But the 10% is why we tune in. And it's a matter of finding what you like and watching it. I'm also a huge music fan. And when people say, well, who's your favorite band? I got to laugh at that too, because I have 100 favorite bands. I go out all the time still to listen to live music, which is what I did when I was a young man. My first regular job was music editor for the Boston Phoenix, and it was my job to go out night after night, listen to the performers and talk to them and do interviews. I seldom made it home before 1 a.m., and I loved doing it. And I started writing professionally because I wanted free records. When I was in college, I went over to a friend's house, and he had a weekly newspaper called Takeover, which fits in the mode of countercultural newspaper. And there were hundreds of new records lined up against his wall. And I said, Mark, where'd you get these records? And he said, well, the record company sent them to us. You want some? All you got to do is write about them. So I loaded my arms up with records and took them home. And that's how I got started writing in general, just started writing about music. But I always wanted to write fiction. That was always in the back of my mind. I wanted to write novels and comics. And it just so happened that I broke big into comics long before I learned how to write a novel. It took me 30 years to learn how to write a novel, but that's because I'm a slow learner. But when I get it, I get it. And I have about 15 novels in print, and I'm working on some more.
So I was looking up on, I think it was Wikipedia, just the page that they have on you, and they said your first published work was in Weird Trips in 1974. That's not a magazine that I actually am aware of. I've never heard of that before. I was wondering if you could describe it for us.
Sure. Uh, Dennis Kitchen, who is retired now and lives in Massachusetts, was one of the pioneers of underground comics. Uh, and he also formed a newspaper, a weekly newspaper in Milwaukee. And this was another countercultural newspaper. And it was called the Daily Bugle. And he may have been inspired by Spider-Man. But one day I heard a knock at my door when I was going to college, and I opened. And there was Dennis Kitchen there. He said, "Hi, so and so sent us over. I heard you like to write," and that's how I met Dennis. And it wasn't until years later, when I was in Boston, working for the Boston Phoenix, that I wrote that article for Dennis. I think it was about how to modify a park squirt gun. But then I started writing stories for him too, and I had the honor of working with the great artist Rand Holmes, who had a very sporadic output and had a difficult life. But Rand Holmes was to Wally Wood what Paul Galassi is to Steranko. He took that Wally Wood style to the nth degree, and the stories are just magnificent. And they're available today. There's a big book from Fantagraphics on Rand Holmes, which I recommend. Anybody who loves that style of art should check him out. And I contributed more stories to Dennis's books. Weird Trips, as you mentioned, uh, it had a very famous cover, which was a cartoon by Dennis that probably cannot be shown today. In fact, I don't think it is. Well, I bet if you look for it, I bet you'll be able to find it. It's not obscene, but it's risque.
So I wanted to ask you because you just mentioned crowdfunded books that you're participating in right now, but Nexus was, I think, your breakout book, and again, you won an Eisner for it. How do you think how much do you think it is important these days, especially to have creator owned content, because this is a character that you still own, Nexus and Badger. If I'm correct, I still believe you still own them. I'm working with Mike Gustovich right now. He created a Justice Machine and things like that, but then he sold them off, and he very much regrets that. How much would you I'd say recommend to people who have their own characters, making their own characters, to hold on to them? Is that something that with Badger and Nexus you found that you could always go back to those characters because you own them and they're yours, and you never let go?
The only reason Steve Root and I own Nexus is because Mike Richardson returned the rights to us after he bought them from First. I don't own Badger. First Comics owns Badger, but they're kind enough to let me uh, write new Badger material from time to time. In fact, we're planning to crowdfund a massive Badger graphic novel that I think is one of the best things I've ever written. Uh, as for owning your own properties, that's always preferable. But everybody wants to do comics and everybody thinks they can do comics and everybody does comics. But remember Sturgeon's Law. Uh, you if you want to do a comic, you only get one chance to make a first impression, and people are putting out comics that really don't know how to tell a story. And when they send the comics to me, I don't criticize them. I tell them what is necessary to grab the reader's attention, and I hope I've been helpful in that way. But as you know, comics are such a simple medium. They attract attention out of all proportion to their numbers. Everybody thinks they can do a comic, and everybody does a comic. But a comic is what you make of it. It's just another storytelling medium, and very few of them are memorable. It's an acquired skill, and we all recognize writers who make memorable comics. Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Chuck Dixon. They've all written comics that I can picture and recall the storylines, and sometimes I even recall the language. Uh, a comic is a peculiar medium. You can get away with things in comics you couldn't in any other medium, and the proof is in the pudding. Look at Superman, who burst on the world in 1939. It was one time they were selling 8 million copies of Superman a year, and it took cinema 50 years to find out to reach the stage with the help of special effects where they could tell a convincing story in which you would believe a man can fly. Because in a comic book, the visuals are only limited by your imagination and the skill of the artist. So you don't have to worry about having a huge budget to create a fantastic city in the jungle. You just need somebody who can draw it. But once you've drawn that city, how does it advance the story? So knowledge of storytelling is essential. You have to uh, understand that a story is a dynamic narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And by dynamic, I mean that the protagonist's fate is always in question. He's up, he's down, he's up, he's down. That's called suspense. Uh, and I think that most of the material the we admire and like to watch or read has to do with tension and release. Tension and release. And the tension is when you're looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and they're in the graveyard and they're having that showdown. Lee Van Cleef and that other guy and Clint Eastwood, uh, and they're all glancing. They're all looking at each other. It takes a long time. They're glancing, glancing, glancing. Then that's the tension, and then finally somebody slaps leather, and they all start shooting, and that's the release. And that's the theory behind the type of storytelling that I do and that I like. So yeah, hang on to
So
your original
you
creations.
you cover a lot of things on your channel, and I would recommend anybody who's listening to this to go over to Mike's channel on YouTube. It's just Mike Barron, but you put things down in little chunks about storytelling, it's very invaluable, I really think. But you talk about show don't tell in connection with the fact that comics are a unique medium where they're forgiving, and you can put in things that you can get a suspension of disbelief going there that is extremely hard to get going in other mediums. But as you're talking about on those videos that I watched on your channel about show don't tell, I was wondering, in that way, do you think that the major carrier of the story in a comic book is the art, and that the writer is a secondary artist in that medium?
Well, that depends on what they're able to accomplish. As we know, comics are a visual medium, and you can have a great writer, but if the comic looks like it was drawn by a child, very few people are going to learn that you're a great writer. There are far more spectacular artists working in comics than there are good writers. That's why when you come across a really powerful story, you remember it. Uh, Show don't tell means that any information you can impart to the reader visually to advance the story, you should. There's no better example of this than the TV show Better Call Saul, which often begins with a 5-minute wordless sequence in which the camera simply follows someone, like Mike Ehrmantraut, for example, and we don't know what he's doing until he obtains a fake security badge. And then we say, oh, I get it. And they did that on a lot of shows. Uh, and in comics, there's a temptation on the part of the writer to add words to every panel, and that's a mistake. Comics are a visual medium, and that doesn't mean that every panel has to have an explosion, because frankly, if you've seen one explosion, you've seen them all. It means that there's space for quiet moments, there's space for the figures to tell the story without dialogue. And one of my pet peeves is when they show fight scenes, which are often incoherent and don't track from panel to panel. The protagonists are talking to each other. Anybody who's ever been in a fight knows that you don't talk to one another uh, unless you're. I'm trying to think. This is a couple of UFC fighters that are the exceptions to this, uh, but if you're in a fight, you're so exhausted, you don't talk to anyone. Your entire mind is on surviving or bettering your opponent, and that's a pet peeve of mine. Show don't tell is a rule for life as well as storytelling. We all know about celebrities who constantly post, well, I went to the children's hospital and I signed books, or I gave $1,000 to the stray cat fund. And that's telling because they want praise, because they want to feed their ego. It's the people who do good works without advertising it that we admire. And sometimes those good works may never come to light, but when they do, when somebody observes them, for instance, Keanu Reeves came to our hospital today and spent time chatting to the children. Uh, our admiration knows no bounds because not only do they demonstrate a generosity of spirit, uh, they generate the strength of their character by resisting the temptation to broadcast to everyone what a good person they are.
So I just wanted to ask you again, when you're talking about show don't tell on your channel, and I've heard you talk about that many times in your videos. I always thought to myself, have you ever done a silent comic?
No, and I never will. I think that they're a waste of space. They take 30 seconds to read and you forget them immediately. That's why you have to parse your words out so carefully in a comic because there are so few of them. We've all flipped through a comic and we come to a page with 250 words and caption after caption and word balloon after word balloon, completely obscuring the art. And when I come to that page, I'm done with the comic. it's just daunting. If I wanted to read a novel, I'd read a novel. You have to parse your words out like gold coins for maximum effect. Because if you may say something memorable in context in a comic that's never been heard before, you've accomplished something important. There are certain examples like "It's Clobbering Time" or "Avengers Assemble." The first time those appeared, they were iconic and they burned their way into the reader's brain so that even people who don't read comics are aware of those phrases. I have readers who cite back to me dialogue in The Badger that I wrote 40 years ago, and I enjoy that. I love to hear it, and it tells me I'm doing something right.
So my other question was kind of on that vein. Have you ever done anything that wasn't a physical comic? Do you do anything that's more of a comic strip, or have you done anything online? Because you do talk a lot about putting establishing shots, at the top of every page, making sure everybody knows with relation to the scene and the characters and all that kind of stuff. And I find that also there's a lot of other rules that I find just play into the turning of the page, especially I think you used to say that I think it was Jack Kirby that said, when you turn that page, it wants to be bam, everything just right in your face. So I don't find that same thing happens with when you don't have the page to turn, when you have just it on the computer, when you're scrolling down and things like that. So have you ever worked in a different medium than physical comics?
Well, I have 15 novels in print. If you go to Amazon, type in Mike Barron, they'll all come up. I'm all over the map. But the most important to me is my
Those are the Star
biker
Wars ones?
stories. No,
Oh,
I didn't write Star Wars. The
okay.
most important novels I have are the biker novels. And they're the ones that are inspired by John D. MacDonald and Travis McGee. Only my character is unique. Josh Pratt's a
The zombie
reformed
biker ones?
motorcycle. Pardon?
Sorry, it was the zombie biker? No, I know you did a story about zombie bikers, I think, at one point.
Nazi biker zombies. That's called Helmet Head. That's not what I'm talking about. Mine are
Okay.
called Biker. They're just called Biker. And there are 9 in print. Josh Pratt is a reformed motorcycle hoodlum who went to prison and found God and comes out and tries to turn his life around. The stories are violent. Many of them are placed in the upper Midwest from where I come, but he goes all over the world. And people come to Josh as they come to Philip Marlowe and Travis McGee as a court of last resort when they've been wronged and can't get satisfaction anywhere else. One of them, Sons of Bitches, is about a young woman who naively publishes her own Muslim comic, a comic about Allah. It's called, Allah, the all powerful. And it's just meant to entertain. But in doing so, she becomes the target of radical jihadists who want to kill her. So she has to hire Josh to protect her. Another one is called Not Fade Away, and it's about an aging hippie living in a trailer park who years ago she was the lover of a famous rock musician, and he wrote a song for her called Marissa. And he gave it to her, and he gave her a letter saying, I will this song to my girlfriend Marissa. She owns all the rights and copyrights forever and ever. And years later, she hears an insurance company using it to sell insurance. So she contacts Josh to prove that she is the rightful owner of that song. She no longer has the letter, but it seems like an impossible task that he undertakes. And that's the kind of thing he does. But every story is different. The last one, Con, is about a nature conservancy group that hires Josh to accompany them to one of these petting zoos. This was inspired by the Tiger King because the state has ordered it closed down, and the Nature Conservancy is going to rescue the animals that remain alive, and they want Josh to go with them to the zoo and provide security because members of the original zoo might still be hanging around and they're violent and insane.
So one of the things you do talk about also about when you're writing comics, again, you mentioned it earlier. It's you must, find the right artist. You need to find someone who's going to draw in the audience as well. But you also have given I think, advice on your channel about how to find good artists, especially the difference between a superhero artist and someone who is going to write more of a Sandman type story where everyone looks very much like you would on a street corner. But where and how, because I get this question a lot from people on my channel, and they're always looking for artists. And I can't remember what exactly your advice was for a burgeoning writer if they want to look for an artist. What, if you can remember, could you give my audience and your audience advice for looking for an artist?
Take a look at Deviant Art. That's a website, deviantart.com. There are thousands of would-be comic book artists there, and you can see their art and judge for yourself, and then you can contact them through DeviantArt. That's a good source.
So also, I think, yeah, now that I remember thinking about it, you also, I'm sure that you were talking about art schools and colleges at the time, and you're saying sometimes you can post, posters there as well to try to draw in someone with your story if you to do an art for a comic.
Well, that's how I found Jeff Butler. I don't know how that's working out today. Because there seems to be less emphasis on art instruction. If you have to go to a college that encourages that kind of culture. But another thing you do is go to local comic book shop, because you can guarantee that any local artists are going to be hanging around, and just ask the proprietor if he knows any artists.
That's a good idea. I had never thought of that, but that's very simple idea that I think everyone should think about. So I just want to get back to your storytelling for a minute, and a lot of what you talk about once again on the videos that you had put out was talking about the thing about, as you said, comics is that it's a forgiving medium, but it's forgiving. I would say much more for the art than for the storytelling, and I think you indicated that as well, saying that there's just so many cliches that can be thrown into a story through the words, and those need to be avoided at all costs. That was one of, I think, your main takeaways from one of your videos that I got. So how do you keep your writing fresh, because you're working on a number of projects right now? So how do you keep your writing fresh so that it doesn't fall into those cliches?
I'm aware of cliches, and I just avoid them. But for anybody who wants to write, I recommend a book called Elements of Style by Strunk and White. It's 70 years old. It's still the best guide to writing. It takes an hour to read. It's very witty, and it explains how to write in an effective manner. And it's simple stuff like avoid the passive tense, uh, contractions, run-on sentences. You just have to develop an ear for a compelling narrative voice. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that people who write in a way that the words themselves are fun to read. It's like you're following a trail of chocolate chips through the forest. Uh, and of course, if you're going to write, you got to read. I keep mentioning Raymond Chandler, who created Philip Marlowe, is kind of the godfather of the hard-boiled detective, and also Dashiell Hammett, who created Sam Spade and the Continental Op. And those two guys were working at the same time. And if you want to see entertaining, no frills writing, I recommend both those guys. A lot of people read Hemingway and they try to write like Hemingway, but there was only one Hemingway. It's better to emulate guys who were just in it for entertainment, like those authors that I mentioned. At the other end of the field, you have Michael Chabon, who's inimitable because his vocabulary is so vast. If you want to learn new words, read Michael Chabon. I'm sure many of our listeners have read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which is his story about the birth of comics. And well, I want you to edit all these ands out now. But if you read Michael Chabon, you get a peek into what a truly unique artist can do. I don't try to do that. I try to have the reader disappear into the story and not even be aware of the words because he's experiencing the story viscerally. That's my goal, to immerse the reader in the suspension of disbelief so that nothing jars him out. We all know what that means. We've all experienced it with some of our favorite authors. You're reading that book and your wife calls from the kitchen, dear, can you come help me? You say, not now, not now. Let me just finish this chapter. And that's when you know that you're reading a compelling writer. Uh, also, if you've been at it long enough and you come to a point where you understand story, you very seldom make a wrong turn. I used to, when I was trying to write novels growing up, I just sit down and wing it. And I get off on a tangent, and before you knew it, I'd written 5,000 words that I really enjoyed, but had nothing to do with advancing the story. But once you would understand what constitutes story, you don't make those mistakes. Uh, you don't wonder if it's any good. You know it's good before you send it out. Uh, it's not just me. I've discussed this with other authors, and we all agree that once you understand story and you've developed a distinctive voice, it's all good. If it's not good, you don't send it out. Uh, and I'm at a point in my life where I think my writing is getting better, which is one of the encouraging things. And I write just as much, if not more, than I ever did. I look forward to it because I see where the story's going. As far as ideas, I never run out of ideas. Writer's block is, uh, well, it might be real for some people, but they're a tiny minority. Uh, the vast majority of professional writers never experience writer's block uh, because they have so many ideas. I would advise any would be writer to carry a pen and a pad with him at all times and write down whatever captures your fancy, be it an unusual name, a turn of phrase, a new scientific discovery. You just fill that notepad up, and when it's filled, you start another one. And that's where ideas come from. Usually, when I get an idea for a story, I start taking notes about anything and everything having to do with the subject or the protagonist. And at a certain point, they reach what I call critical mass, which means that I see the shape of the story before me. That's when I write an outline. I didn't used to write outlines, but now I do write outlines, not just for novels, but for a comic book series I'm working on. I'll write an outline. At some point, when you're writing the actual work, you're going to deviate from the outline. It always happens without fail. There's no problem with it. It's because you've learned something new or you've surprised yourself. Uh, a writer must surprise himself before he can surprise others. And every writer who creates an enduring character knows that at some point the character will turn around and tell you what he's going to do next.
So, when you're talking about grabbing the reader and giving them a compelling story, and you had mentioned this earlier in our talk, um, you talk about it in terms in your own videos about having a pulse to a story, about going up and down and up and down. I just want
Right.
to I just wanted to ask you about what your personal techniques would be to keep that pulse going. Do you have does it just come to you, or do you have certain things that you rely on for certain parts of the story that the middle of the story needs to go up this way and the ending needs to go down that way? Do you have any of those for your own writing that you rely on constantly?
Well, there are no tricks. You have to put obstacles in the protagonist's way. Uh, Sometimes when I'm writing something, I will introduce characters in the first part of the book uh, because they're interesting to me. And when I get towards the end, they become the key to the resolution of the plot. Uh, that's how you avoid du machina, which means that there's a sudden mysterious element seemingly sent down from the gods to resolve your situation. And you can't do that. You have to plant the seeds for the resolution earlier in the story. The perfect ending to a story, in my opinion, should come as both a complete surprise and, in retrospect, inevitable. The best example I can think of that is the ending to the original Planet of the Apes, when Charlton Heston comes across the Statue of Liberty half buried in the sand and realizes that he's on Earth. Well, of course he's on Earth. But at that point, the reader or the viewer has accepted the fact that he was on an alien planet. And then you realize, well, of course he's on Earth.
So I wanted to move into talking about some of the projects that you have on the go right now, because I have a list of them here, and there are just so many. I think last time I listened to a video of yours, you talked about working on Brand Star, which is a supernatural Western. You have Private American, which is in demand. You're working on a Sherlock Holmes novel. Or is it a graphic novel where he meets Captain Nemo? There's a Badger graphic novel, which you mentioned already. There's also a science fiction story graphic novel that you're working on, which is I think you said a combination of sort of 2001 and Star Wars, and also you're adapting zombie novels as well into graphic novel form. That's a lot of material to be working on at once. Do you want to talk about any of those in particular?
Let me take them in order. The Private American is about a vigilante on the southern border. It came about because I asked myself what Punisher would be doing today, and seemed obvious. He'd be on the southern border intercepting human traffickers, drug smugglers, and terrorists that are flowing across our unprotected border. This should not be a risible subject, and only in today's hyper politicized environment has it become a hot topic. And because of this story, the Daily Cost, a far left hate site, attacked me out of the blue, calling me a racist and the book racist. The person who wrote the article has never read anything I wrote. Her description of the books was 180 degrees from what they're really about. But because of her demands and her shrieking, illogical hate speech, she succeeded in having us kicked off of Kickstarter and Crowdfunder. We're still on Indiegogo, but like many other campaigns, we're shadow banned, which means you can't find it if you go to Indiegogo and enter The Private American. The book is pure excitement. It's dynamite. It explodes on the first page. You won't be able to put it down. And when you're finished, you're going to say, wow, why can't all comics be this good? If you're interested in backing it, go to theprivateamerican.com. Theprivateamerican.com will take you right to the website. Next up is Bronze Star, a supernatural Western that I'm doing with Pat Broderick. It's the best work of Pat's career, and that's saying something. It's brilliant. I've been posting art on Facebook and Twitter from time to time so people can see what's going on, but that barely scratches the surface. I've posted maybe 1% of the art that's going to be in the book. Follow me on Twitter at Bloody Red Baron. Find me on Facebook at The Comics and Novels of Mike Baron. That's where I post most of this art. After that, the next book up is Florida Man graphic novel number 2. Now, this has been written for a while, but I'm very excited about it. It's even funnier than the first one. These novels I'm adapting, I don't know when they're going to see the light of day, but they're based on the novels of John Ringo, and they have to do with a man-made zombie plague. And John wrote the first one in 2010, and the whole thing is eerily reminiscent of the COVID scare. Chuck Dixon wrote the first graphic novel in the series, and I'm taking over from Chuck. It's called Black Tide Rising, and you can probably get Chuck's graphic novel at Barnes & Noble, or you certainly get it on Amazon. I'm also adapting a screenplay called Jan Kroon into a graphic novel with Henry Martinez. Jan Kroon is a star-spanning science fiction saga that takes place 1,000 years in the future, where humans find themselves in a battle to the death with an alien race called the Kroon. It's exciting. It's brilliant. The graphics are brilliant. They're going to offer it as pamphlets piecemeal. And the first one is done. I don't know when they're going to print and distribute, but people will know because I'm going to post it on my webpage. We also have a military science fiction novel that I wrote with Major Diggs Brown, who served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. And this also is about humanity in a far flung future where military forces go to the aid of a planet that's in thrall to an insidious theocracy, which is a tyranny. And they have to hook up with the natives and plot out their tactics, guerrilla tactics, to overturn the government. We're really excited about that. It's a big novel. It's the longest novel I've ever worked on, although Diggs did most of the writing, and it's at Bain right now, and we don't know what the outcome is. I have not yet heard from the editor. And I'm working on my 10th biker novel, which is called Seventh Son, and it's about a feud that goes back to the Civil War. And I'm probably working on some other stuff I can't think of right now.
Are you still on Substack? I know you were at one
Yes,
point.
absolutely. Substack. Go take a look at my Substack column. Please subscribe. I talk a lot about popular culture, things that matter to me. I'm all over the place. I did a recent column about how Harley Davidson is committing suicide by vowing to go all electric and why that's a bad idea. But I also talk about movies I love and music that I love. I'm a huge power pop fan. I'm still writing about music. I mentioned that earlier. The only reason I write about music today is to get free records. That's the way I started. But I don't mind. It's for a friend's website, and I get to keep up with new developments in power pop. And for people who are unfamiliar with the term, it merely means exciting, popular music with a driving rock beat, bridges, and hooks. And it's characterized by the Beach Boys, the Beatles, the Byrds, Cheap Trick, the Raspberries. Those are all power pop.
Very interesting. So I just wanted to thank you so much for coming here. And I wanted to let you know that I think for myself, anyways, you're writing a lot of people that I know would say Badger or Nexus, but quite honestly, what I remember for myself is because I wasn't in a place where I could get indie comics freely was your Hawk and Dove run. I think that was my introduction to those characters, and I thought if I had the chance, I wanted to thank you very much for introducing me to those characters. Those are wonderful stories that you had created. With that, I think we'll wrap this up. If there's anything else that you want to talk about, I'll give you the floor for another minute.
Well, thank you, RJ. There's not too much that I have to say, unless you push the right button, then I'll go on for hours. But it's always a pleasure and an honor to be asked to talk about writing, and I hope that this is helpful.
Oh, it is immensely helpful, I'm sure. And as I said, for anyone who wants good writing tips, go over to Mike's YouTube. I'm going to include the links for everything as much as possible, anyways, that he has talked about here in the description of this video. But his YouTube as well, he does give very poignant short videos about creating characters, creating stories, how to make sure that your story runs according to a good rhythm, everything that you need to do to get the basics down for fantastic writing. So thank you once again for coming here, Mike, and talking to us about storytelling.
My pleasure.
So I want to thank everybody who has made it this far and is still listening. If you have anything to add to this conversation, please put it in the comments. And also just a quick reminder that the links for my graphic novels are in the description. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, you might want to check out those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.